And I got to tell you, the fear that was in my heart, seeing that it was a poultry-based dish. So let's you and me try to fight off the tryptophan, okay? So right now, so we've talked about now, to recap, the whys of supported decision-making. We've talked about one how of supported decision-making. We have taken a person from age 3 to, I hope, age 21 or 22, developing the supports and services needed to start to live those type of independent lives. But we don't stop at education. In the same way that decision-making is a lifelong endeavor, there are services and supports available throughout the lifespan to make this a reality. And the one that we're going to talk about now is based in employment. Specifically, services and supports you can get through the vocational rehabilitation program. So let's start, as always, with our article of faith, which is this. Wouldn't it be awesome if there was a program that was available to any person with a disability to help get the supports and services we just talked about from special ed? Because as you know, not everyone is eligible for special education. Not everyone can get those supports and services in school. So wouldn't it be great if there was just one that was available to all people with disabilities and that could provide those services and supports? And the good news is there is. That program is called the Vocational Rehabilitation Program, or VR. Every state has one, including right here in Missouri. And the whole point of the VR program is to work with people with disabilities so that they can prepare for and engage in employment. So what's it all about? Key words, again, coming from the law. We can go right back to the source. I promised you early on. Nothing I'm telling you about today requires any changes in existing law or policy. So let's look at what VR is supposed to do. The whole point of the VR program is to help people prepare for, secure, retain, advance, or regain employment. To help people get jobs, keep jobs, advance jobs, or get a job back. That is the whole point of the VR program. So you're thinking what I know you're thinking. This was about getting supports and services on supported decision-making. You're telling me about a jobs program. How's that work? We were talking about independent living a second ago. We were talking about adult daily living skills, and you're telling me about work. Where's the connection? Well, I got a question for you. What if the same things you need to work are the same things you need to live independently and avoid guardianship? Well, I can tell you this. The obligation of the VR program is to provide any service that a person needs to prepare for, gain, advance in, or regain employment. So if you need anything to prepare for or get a job, then the VR program can and must provide it, necessarily including independent living skills like decision making. And that is why I say that VR programs have more potential to do more good in more ways than any other program. And when I talk about VR in states, I always get a certain number of people who've had a bad experience with VR. Okay? I call them the eye rollers. I'm looking out, I can see y'all, okay, I know. You're rolling your eyes, me talking about VR. VR doesn't do that in this state. To which I say, please, don't roll your eyes. Know your rights. So I'm going to tell you exactly how you can make this happen. Because just like schools having an obligation, a job to prepare people for independent living, whether or not they do it, and it's on us to make sure they do, the same is true of VR. They have a job to provide those services, and it is on us to hold them to it. So, basics of VR. To be eligible for vocational rehabilitation, you need to have 3 things. You need to have a disability. And that disability has to affect your ability to work. It has to cause you difficulty in getting or keeping a job. 2, you have to want to work. And 3, VR services have to be able to help you work. You gotta have a disability, you gotta want to work, you gotta need help working that VR can provide. Good news? if the person you're working with or you is receiving Social Security, SSI or SSDI, you are presumed eligible. It's a big step. SSI or SSDI, you're already in. It is really hard to be ineligible for VR. Flat out, it is hard because it is not your obligation to prove that you are eligible. You are presumed eligible. It is on VR to say that you can't work and to prove that you cannot work. And that means if VR thinks that you are too disabled to work, and that is a typical phrase they use, you are too disabled to benefit from VR services, the law is very clear. They have to give you a chance to work. They have to give you an opportunity called a trial work experience. That has to be in an area that you're interested in, that matches your skills and interests. You have to have multiple opportunities to work. And only then can they go to a hearing officer and say, this person is too disabled to work. And they must prove that by clear and convincing evidence. We've all seen Law and Order. We know that you have to be guilty by a beyond a reasonable doubt. That's 99.9%. We all know that in the civil system, we win by the preponderance of the evidence, or we are 51% sure. Clear and convincing evidence is more than that. You have to be at least 75% sure, the judge is, that you can't benefit. And they can only do that after giving you the opportunity to work. So I say again, it is really hard to be ineligible. I have worked with students in a number of cases where VR is taking the position that you can't work, your IQ is too low. So where's your trial work experience? Oh, well, the person did do some greeting at Walmart. Aha, the person worked. Or this person did do some job sampling in transition services. Aha, that person worked. That's proof the person worked. You don't have to be able to work right now, by the way. It is have the ability to work if you get supports and services. It is exceedingly hard to be ineligible. Yes?
My question is kind of the reverse. If a family and the student or individual refuse to, in the transition meetings or whatever, participate with VR, can Social Security then deny them the Social Security? You know?
Whew, tough one.
I got a student trying to do that.
So let's work through this fact. A person does not want to work through VR. Does the person not want to work at all?
Right.
If the person does not want to work at all, so to get SSI or SSDI, you have to be unable to work. It's a different classification of unable to work than the ADA has. My feeling is you could get, and this is a guess, I've never had this situation before, so please, to the camera, your mileage may vary, this is not legal advice. I'm guessing that the situation you're describing, the person could still be eligible for SSI because it's based upon having a disability that leaves you unable to work. And then you could enter into the Ticket to Work program if you wanted to get employment services, but there's nothing in the law that says you must work with VR. So my take would be, the fact that I don't want to work with VR does not render me ineligible for SSDI because they're two different programs. I feel pretty comfortable with that. Although that was not legal advice, your mileage may vary.
My comment was that just because someone's deemed unable to work through VR does not mean they don't qualify for services through DMH to still get supported employment.
You're absolutely correct. There's lots of places where you can get supported employment services. In fact, through Medicaid, through departments of mental health, through DD service agencies. It's true. One of the reasons I always recommend people to VR is because of the breadth of services that are available, which we're going to talk some about. But yes, you should never give up. Although again, I tell you, if VR tells you you can't work, that's challengeable. I can say I have never lost a case of VR saying you can't work, even with people who have washed out of jobs before, even with people who haven't gotten along with their counselor. It is a difficult thing for them to prove. Think about it. If you have any employable skills, you can have VR services. They should at least work with you to see where you are. Down the road, if you refuse to take part or you don't do well, maybe they can close you. But not opening you, to me, is very difficult and problematic. So you don't have to prove that you can work. Again, you don't have to be able to work right now. What you have to be able to do is have the skills that with appropriate services you could work. So once you are deemed eligible, once you are found eligible, you meet those steps, what you are entitled to is a plan. An individualized plan for employment, or IPE. I know it sounds just like IEP, and there we go with acronyms again. But the whole point of the IPE is to set out the person's eventual employment goal, where the person is supposed to say, this is what I want to do for a living. Not now maybe, but down the road. This is my eventual destination. The person works with VR to come up with that, and if VR agrees it's an appropriate goal, VR supports it. Now here's the thing, the IPE, once again, is not based upon your ability to work in that job right now. It is based upon your ability to eventually be able to do that job down the road. I will give you an example. Because VR cannot condition what types of supports and services they provide on your ability to do something right now, if you have the ability to do it down the road. There was an attorney I hired years ago when I was in the protection and advocacy system. She was deaf. She, in Alabama, had worked with VR, and she was very smart, said, I want to be a lawyer. Will you support me in that? And they said, well, yeah, you're smart, but that takes time, is a lot of money. How about we support you to be a paralegal? She said, I don't want to do that. I want to be a lawyer. Here's my abilities. Here's my, and VR wasn't able to refuse based upon just what they felt like funding. So the person chooses the goal, and then the services and supports follow the goal. And that's important because we're not talking about just any job. The person controls this process. So it's not just any job they feel like putting you in. And that is one of the top complaints I hear about VR. They just put people in that type of job. Oh, this is the area that people like you, work in. So I went so far as to include a citation to the law, because my big strategy with VR, and you all should adopt this if you're having any kind of issue like that, is when VR says they can't do something, just smile and say, which regulation says that? Usually what happens is they go in the back, they flip through some pages, and they come back and go, oh yeah, we're going to do it for you, we don't have to. So
they tell us they won't provide ongoing services or support to keep a job. It has to be clear that this person could work without support, or they won't.
Within 3 months.
That would be wrong. That would be way wrong. And these are the two things we get from VR a lot. Okay? One is, once you are employed for 90 days, we will close you. We do that all the time. And the second is no ongoing support. So I'm going to jump into these because you probably hear these all the time anyway. Both of those statements are wrong. Okay? They are completely wrong. Number one, this works directly toward the job goal choice. If a person chooses a particular job goal, that person has a right to VR services until that person reaches that goal. That's what I mean by not just any job, your job. So the lawyer I hired, if along the way through law school she worked as a telemarketer, as I did, she did not have the right to have her, she could not have her job closed after 90 days of telemarketing. So you have to meet the job goal specifically. And here's another one that they never tell you, but I'm telling you specifically from the regulation. It's a fun one. They can close your case if you have reached your job goal and you agree you have met your goal. The person has a veto. Period, end of quote. I have one case is based upon that. The regulation is written in the conjunctive. So it's reached it and I agree to the closure. Absolutely, positively. So they can't just say, we think you've made it. I had a guy whose job goal was analyst, and he got promoted to like intermediate analyst. We had to argue. I don't agree that I've met my goal. I know it says analyst in the title, but this is what I consider analyst to be. We won. Second, with regard to ongoing support, what they're talking about there is supported employment. Okay, the regulation says that supported employment is supposed to last 180 days. It then says, unless the person really needs it. Those aren't the exact words, but it's unless there is an agreement. And here's the thing, that's where your job is to prove why I still need supported employment. In DC, they group all kinds of things into supported employment, so people run out of their hours all the time, even when they're not employed. And I say, so you're going to cut me off from supported employment services. I don't have a job yet? Of course it's still needed. So if I have a job, and I've got a job coach, and that job coach is the one thing standing between me losing or keeping that job, then I'll be spending more 400 days. So yeah, it's again why language is so important, and why my question to them is always so important. Show me the red. Show me the language that says that you can't support something unless I can meet it in 90 days, and you will close it in 90 days. It's simply incorrect. And it drives me crazy because there is such a disparity of power here, right? The VR people, they've got the information, they've got the skills, and as you'll see in a little bit, they're supposed to be sharing that with you. But when they don't, when they say something like that, you are inclined to believe them because of the power dynamic. Oh, they must know. It's wrong. So always remember which regulation says that. So when they say, we're not going to support you, even though I think you might be able to do this, this is what you do. We put people like you in the bricklayer class. Which regulation says it? Okay? Your job, your interest, and not one of what I call 4F jobs. These are the 4 Fs of voc rehab. They love putting people in food, filth, flowers, and filing. Okay. You're going to serve food or work in fast food. You're going to sweep up. You're going to do some light clerical, or you're going to work in a flower shop. To this day, I don't know what the affinity is for flower shops in the VR system, but I don't know if it's happening here. I've certainly seen it.
The forest for soft touches.
Okay, so that's as good a reason as any. But no, so it's your job. It is the person's preference. Never listen to the 4F positions. If the person going to VR doesn't know what he or she wants to be, then ask for assessments. In the same way that in special education you have a right to an evaluation, you have a right to ask for a job assessment. They call them VOC assessments, vocational assessments. They're standardized tests that are supposed to determine a person's skills, a person's interests, and then suggest possible careers where they intersect. It may not come up with a solution, but it may. I have seen VOC assessments come up with people going, yeah, I never knew I'd want to do that, but I'd like to try. So don't let them just shuttle people off into one of the 4 Fs. It is not just any job. It's your job. And once you've got your job lined up and we're all in agreement, like I said, it is their obligation to provide you with the supports and services that you need to get there. And more importantly, you need to overcome the barriers. They're big on that phrase, the barriers to employment. Often you will see, when you look at their files, they'll actually list what those barriers are. And they have standardized categories, again, things like interpersonal relations or organization or basic work skills. These are the barriers to employment. So the services and supports that they're supposed to provide are the ones that are designed to help you reach the job that you've agreed to reach and overcome the barriers to you getting that job. And again, there's your regulation in case you're asked. So, your turn. I've given you a couple of barriers to employment. You tell me, what are some other ones that people you know or you've worked with that may have barriers to employment? What are some typical ones that you see? Ma'am?
Transportation.
Transportation. I can't get to work. Good. What else? Ma'am?
Communication.
Communication. I cannot make myself, I can work with people, both direct communication and interpersonal relations too. I can't get along with people as well. Ma'am?
Not getting accommodations at their workplace.
Job accommodations, either because the workplace is unaware of what's there or because I may not be able to communicate very well what I need. Others, ma'am?
Not having the requirements or skill sets to do that job.
Not having basic work skills either for any job or that job in particular. Others? Ma'am?
Guardianship.
Guardianship can be a barrier because some guardians don't want people to work.
Right.
That goes back to the very first presentation I did. What kind of right is it if you can't exercise it? Others?
Attitude.
Attitude is legit, actually. It could be that a person literally has difficulty getting along with other people. The fancy phrase for that
On the other
is...
end, the attitude of...
Oh, prevailing societal attitudes,
Yeah,
absolutely. So that's what I mean. Look what you've just done. You have thought broadly. That's the point of the VR process. We don't think narrowly with a 4F job. We think broadly about what the person needs or wants, and then we think what's in the way of it. That's the point of this process. VR is designed to help think broadly. What is standing in between me and that job, and to help me overcome that. And here's what I get at why VR is so awesome. These are just some of the things VR can provide. Here again is your legal citation. This citation has a list. That list goes from letter A to letter S, listing the services and supports that VR must provide if they are needed. A through S. Oh, I forgot, there's a T. The T is anything else the person might need. Now are you starting to see my point? Let's just look at some of them. Ma'am?
What about when they limit on funding? We don't have the funds, we don't have the funds.
I'm going to get to funding and assess, but I can tell you the short version. Once you receive an IPE, once you are found eligible and you have an IPE, they cannot deny you a service for lack of funding, period. If they have a funding issue, they can ask the feds to limit the number of people they find eligible or provide services to. You can be found eligible at any time, but they can establish a wait list for services. Once you get into services, defined as having an IPE, they cannot decline a service because of cost. And again, I go back to what I say in the education system. One person ain't going to break it. You don't balance your budget on the back of my person. So let's look at some of those things from A through T. Assessments, one of the most important things. Because what if you don't know what you want to be or what you might need? They can pay for any type of assessment. Counseling, job coaches, counseling, medical and mental health care counseling, assistive technology. Do you need a laptop for this job? Do you need a hearing aid because your hearing impairment is causing trouble? Glasses are considered assistive technology. Medical and mental health care. How important is that for some people who have cyclical disabilities and limited insurance? All of these things can be provided. And yes, ma'am, in the back, transportation is a mandated service. VR absolutely must provide transportation services. That would include, if the only thing available is a taxi, they got to pay for the taxi.
You're kidding.
I am right with you.
She is making a note.
They are allowed to prefer cheaper methods of transportation, including paying someone per mile or saying paratransit's available, use it. But I've had situations where paratransit's been so unreliable, I argue that, yes, we'll try it, but when they're late, you're getting a taxi and they have to pay. They have to provide that for as long as you need the service.
Really, not just for the 180 days or?
Again, I view the 180 days as bogus. Because if the person still needs services beyond that, then the person still needs service. Now, it might be that you're done with the service of 180 days and then transportation gets cut off. Okay? But as long as you are assessed, for example, let's combine them. I have to get a vocational eval, an assessment. It is 3 counties over. I have no way to get there. Absolutely, transportation is a necessary component of that service. Ma'am?
Back to something that you just said about paying somebody. Back to what you said about somebody, VR paying somebody mileage. Is that having to go through a transportation company, or can they pay, say, a community member?
There's nothing preventing them from paying a community member. The VR agency may have a procurement policy that requires a person before they get paid to enter into a contract and have certain assurances. That's state by state. But I've had plenty of people pay mileage for transportation because it was the only option and the least expensive option. I mean, we've seen that. We see the same thing in Medicaid. I mean, the same thing can happen. Medicaid non-emergency transportation can be a person paid for mileage. Same thing can be in VR. I will tell you unequivocally, transportation is a required service. I say this unequivocally not because I'm a genius, but because I can read. I can read, but it's in the law. And again, when they say, ma'am, we can't provide transportation, you say, you know what's funny? I was looking at 34 CFR 361.48. I see transportation there. Do you? Period. They can pay for interpreters. They can pay for job coaches. They can pay for on-the-job training. They can pay for something called maintenance, which could be a stipend while you're getting on-the-job training. They can pay just for services to family members. I have a child, I can't work unless the kid has daycare. Boom, it gets paid for. If that's the barrier, it gets paid for. Period, end of quote. And what I consider to be, I maybe got a bad idea. We'll make it work. Other things I have gotten paid for, okay? Because it falls under the rubric of there are services and supports that are needed to help a person get employed. I've gotten rent paid for by VR. Why? It's awfully hard to get a job with no fixed address. I'm not talking about a year's rent. I'm talking about a month or two temporary on-your-feet rent. Clothing paid for. It's hard to work. You don't have an interview suit. I've gotten dental work paid for because it was standing in between that person and the job. Therapy services like medical, mental health care, occupational therapy, physical therapy. If these things are in between you and working, they can be paid for. And I say that because to me there's a biggie. I consider this to be the big one. This is what it all comes back to. This is one of the ones, it's a quote from the law. They must provide, note the language carefully, vocational and other training services, including the provision of personal and vocational adjustment training, books, tools, and other services. Now I want you to note carefully the word personal and other, because we hear from VR all the time, we're not paying for that, it's not job related. It's not work-based. Vocational and other training services. War story from you. This is the last voc rehab trial I had. Worked with a young man who was graduating high school. Intellectual disabilities. He worked with his VR counselor to identify a program to take after high school. Everyone agreed that he wasn't quite ready to work yet. He had identified barriers to employment by them of things like everything we've talked about. Communication, interpersonal abilities, he had work skill limitations, and what everyone decided he needed after post-secondary education. He needed a program. Fit out and they found one. It was in New York. He's in DC. The only one they found that actually was geared toward what he needed and what he did, because it was, essentially you're working. The place had contacts in the community to work, and at the other times they were working on independent living skills, like the ability to take care of yourself, self-care, community living, communication, interpersonal skills, the things they said that were in between him and working. Everything was hunky-dory until they got the bill. The bill for the school was $70,000 a year. At which point VR said, oh, we can't pay for this. This isn't employment-based. Look at this, you're learning how to take your medication. You're learning about talking to people and functional math. How is this employment-based? To which point, I got out my little book. And I said, it says, and other, including the provision of personal services. You, VR, found this person's barriers. This school is set up to overcome those barriers. You haven't identified any other options. Therefore, this is it. This is a vocational, because he was working, and personal adjustment, because it was working on things like interpersonal skills and communication. It fit right within that regulation. It took a week's worth of trial. Judge ruled in our favor. That young man is now going into his, where are we? We are in March. He'll be finishing up his second year of that school. He's on pace to become a physical therapist and to overcome the barriers that were in place that would have kept him from doing it. Why? Because he sought vocational and personal adjustment training. Now that's the key jumping off point to this slide. Because VR of necessity then does more than just, quote unquote, vocational, don't they? They have to. Because if all they did was place you in a job, which lots of VRs unfortunately do, Oh, you're available, we're going to give you a job, counselor, and we'll beat the pavement until you get a job at Chipotle. Wrong. If they're doing what they're supposed to do, which is truly helping you overcome the barriers, then of necessity, they have to help you overcome limitations in things like independent skills, help you become more self-determined. And remember what we know about self-determination. It's directly correlated to increased employment. So self-determination is already baked into the VR goal of employment. So if there is something that is in between you and becoming more self-determined, then that's a barrier to employment. They've got to help you get the services and supports to overcome it, necessarily including personal adjustment services. Why is that important? Because after all this talk about work, I imagine at least someone here is thinking, what in the world does this have to do with supported decision-making and guardianship? We were here talking about independent living and guardianship and supported decision-making. You're giving me a bunch of work stuff. What does this have to do with it? Well, again, I say, what is supported decision-making? We use friends and family members and professionals to help us make decisions and overcome the need for guardianship, right? Well, VR has that already in it. There is language in the VR law, all over the VR law, in fact, requiring that VR ensure, quote, informed choice. Informed choice, by definition, is when the VR people inform each applicant and eligible individual of the availability of services so that the person can understand. It's supposed to be a team process. The counselor works with the person so the person understands his or her options. The counselor's job is to work with the person so the person can figure out what job goal might be best. The counselor is supposed to exercise informed choice so the person can understand the supports and services he or she needs and choose the right job goal and choose the right supports and services, all with the support of the VR counselor who ensures informed choice. Doesn't that sound familiar? Doesn't that sound just like self-determination and being an actor in your system and doing things rather than having things done to you? Taking steps rather than having things dictated to you? And why is that important? We know why people are put under guardianship. We know it because society thinks they can't take care of themselves. So what if the very things, I asked this question before, I'm asking it again. What if the very things that are driving you toward guardianship are the things stopping you from working? What I would call employment-based skills, like inability to take care of yourself, inability to be organized, communications issues, and problems getting along with other people. What if those are the things keeping you from working? To which VR always goes, wait a second, that's not an employment-based skill. Communication isn't an employment-based skill. Just getting along with people isn't an employment-based skill. To which point I say, would you hire someone who's not going to get along with your customers? No. Would you hire someone who can't tell you about that day's work? Would you retain someone on staff who can't get along with your coworkers? Of course you wouldn't. Of course those things are employment-based skills. Would you hire someone who has a long history of not taking care of him or herself and always getting sick? These are employment skills. So by definition, if a person's life skill limitations are impacting a person's ability to work, then by definition, VR has to provide the supports and services to help the person overcome them. Yes, ma'am?
I have a question. I have a young man who went to voc rehab, and he has a letter from voc rehab that says when he has no behaviors for 6 months, they will work with him. What? I'm thinking that's a life, that's keeping him from getting a job.
When you have no behaviors for 6 months, they will work with you. I'm going to take this seriously in 1 second, but the first thing I'm going to say is there is no 6-month period in my life where I have not had That's like I did a lot of mental health work, and a lot of times a person's care plan would say, this person needs to overcome use of foul language. To which I say, drive the beltway. You know, go to an amusement park, watch a baseball game. There ain't no shortage of foul language. Now, let me take this seriously. What they did to that person breaks the law. Period. End of quote. What they are saying is, you may not even apply for services until we have decided you are behavior-free by some weird definition of what a behavior is. That gives them control over the entire application process, where what the law says is a person with a disability, and that disability is affecting their ability to work, who needs services to overcome it, gets VR services. Now, if this person is having behaviors, that sounds a lot to me like those behaviors are in the way of that person's ability to work.
That's where I'm at.
And it sounds to me like there's all kinds of VR-based supports and services, like medical and mental health care counseling, like job coaching, like medication services if that's what's needed, that could help overcome those barriers. So where I'm at is, what they're doing is they're shirking their responsibility. It could be that the young man you're working with is a pain in the butt. I am. They may not like working with him. He may be difficult. He may be verbally abusive. He may not be a nice guy in their opinion. Those are not reasons why a person should not get VR services. Those are reasons why a person needs them. They cannot say to you, we are going to control your ability to live your life based upon our definition of what a behavior is. I'd be very happy to talk to you more in detail, but I would be considering other options at that point. And if you haven't been in touch with your protection and advocacy system, I would strongly consider it. The P&A has a program devoted to helping people acquire voc rehab skills. It's called the CAP program, or CAP. I'd give them a call. Because that is an absurd thing to say to someone. I don't care if a person has behaviors or if they're difficult. Do your job. So, if you've got behaviors or other life skills limitations that stand in between you and working, they've got to provide the services and supports to help you overcome them. How do they do it? They do it by working with you, by you choosing the supports and services that you need to overcome your limitations. That can be anything. And ma'am, looking at the screen right now, I see 3 that could conceivably help your young man. There could be assistive technology, medical and mental health care, and education and training programs, all of which could help address behaviors. So they don't have the power to cut you off based solely on that. So let's put it together. Let's put the VR process together. A person is eligible because he or she has disabilities that get in the way of his or her ability to work. Once they are eligible, they are entitled to supports and services to help overcome those limitations. And then you choose those services, like vocational and other training, to help overcome those limitations. And while you're doing that, think about where you are. You're gaining the skills needed to become employed, and you are gaining the skills needed to demonstrate that you can take care of yourself in a manner that society deems is appropriate. You're getting work, and you are avoiding guardianship. Think about it this way. We discussed informed choice, right? Informed choice is the counselor working with the person to help the person understand his or her options, so the person can choose for him or herself the services and supports that are best for him or her. Anyone care to tell me what that sounds like? It sounds like supported decision making, doesn't it? It's already baked into the system. And the thing about VR, where it becomes particularly important, is that VR can serve anyone at any age. You never age out of VR. If you are 80 years old and you want to work, you can go to VR. But it is particularly important, it is particularly relevant to students in special education. Because we have a law called the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act, or WIOA, that has made real serious changes to the VR program by saying flat out, you must VR put emphasis on helping young adults in transition so that they can go from school to work. Because VR, again, I tell you, nothing I tell you changes the way law currently is. Everything I'm talking about is already in the law. So the law already says that VR must get involved in special education, quote, as early as possible. And by the way, another common VR complaint I hear is that you go to VR and VR says come back when you're 18, right before you graduate. Anybody hear that?
Oh, yeah.
They're breaking the law. Again, when you hear that, which regulation says you can do that? Have this one in your pocket. Is 18 as early as possible? I don't think so. Transition starts at 16. That's as early as possible, ma'am.
Well, our vocational rehab in our area is fabulous, but they contract to providers. We only have one provider in our area. Is that provider legally responsible to provide all these things that you're saying vocational rehab is responsible for? Because if they come back and say, the provider comes back and says, we can't provide transportation or we can't provide schooling, then can they send out letters? Or could it be a provider that sends out a letter that says, we can't work with him until his behavior's better?
Here's my answer to this. Please don't think I'm being obnoxious. My answer is I don't care if the provider can provide it or not, because Voc Rehab is responsible for ensuring it gets provided. So if Voc Rehab has one provider and one provider only, and the provider can't provide a mandated service, then Voc Rehab will do it. I've said that to other Voc Rehab. It's, you know, if they can't do it, you do. I don't care who does it, but you have to do it. A provider may be able to say, we don't have the infrastructure to provide transportation. So be it, so long as VR picks up the slack. That's my answer, because the provider isn't obligated by federal law to do it. VR is. Now, the VR should probably look to its contract with the provider. I would be thinking that my contract with the provider would say, we're going to pay you and you're going to provide all these things. But if it doesn't, that's not my problem, that's not my kid's problem. Okay, so if the provider can't do it, VR better. Because ultimately it comes back to VR. Remember what we said about special education. The school is responsible for providing these things. It may be that they coordinate with others, but at the end of the day, the buck stops with them. Same with VR. Never take one person saying, I can't do that as an answer, especially when you've got something as broad and far-reaching as VR. Who else had their hand down?
I did, but I was just going to reiterate the fact that if they can't find it, their job is to find it.
Exactly. If they can't find it, it's their job. Remember this, okay? Remember this. We have a real problem in this society about people with disabilities and that you have to, it's your job thing. Because we've been taught for 2,000 years that what we're doing is we're doing the best we can and being as kind as possible to the less fortunate, right? So what you're telling me comes right from that attitude. Hey, we're trying, but we just can't do it, so you're going to have to be satisfied with what we can do. And when I hear that, I give the same answer every time. Please feel free to steal this. There was one day when I was driving down I-95. Now, back in my younger days, I had a convertible. I loved that convertible. And on a good spring summer day, I could do 95 easy in that thing and be loving life. And one day a cop pulled me over and he said, do you know how fast you were going? I said, yes, officer, I know exactly how fast I was going. Look at this weather. Look at this car. I mean, I was trying to do 65, but I just can't do it. So don't write me a ticket. I don't think that gets you off. I don't think I was trying, but I drive a convertible gets me out of a speeding ticket. Neither should we're trying, but we just don't provide transportation get you out of your legal obligations, provider or VR. Period, end of quote. You're not providing a charitable service. You are fulfilling a legal obligation. And until we get that down, until we are prepared to tell the providers and agencies of the world, this is your obligation, I will hold you to it, things ain't gonna change.
We're probably using the word reasonable, but is there some kind of time frame to where they have to provide that service, that they don't have it?
To me,
so that it's not.
you can always read in reasonable, but reasonable doesn't mean we're going to try for 2 years. At some point, VR has to write a check. You know, I've had cases where VRs had to pay for an outside of the state organization to come in and do adaptive driving lessons because no one in the state had the car necessary. Tough. You know, again, it's part of the law. So eventually what you've got to be able to do is keep pointing them. That's why I have all these citations here. Keep pointing them that and say, you've got to do this. It's incredibly important.
Yeah. So if we had an individual who never graduated, never got a GED or anything like that, then VR is required to open a case and help them gain that.
They certainly can be. They certainly can be, especially if the lack of high school diploma is a barrier in the way of that person getting a job. I've had several people who are having GED prep courses paid for. To me, that's an easy one. It's harder to get college paid for because it's much more expensive, but the same theory applies. If the education is necessary to get the job. Well, think of it this way. This is a much easier one. What if my job goal is plumbing? There's a license required. There's an exam I have to pass to get that. No one would question if you need to have a license to be a plumber or an electrician. Why would anyone question that I need a GED to get this job or that job or a bachelor's or a law degree? It's naturally a part of it. And it is absolutely required. It's required because we know the regulation says vocational and other educational services.
I support an individual who wants to go to school to be an RN, and she's going through voc rehab, and they're kind of trying to tell her that she doesn't possess the skills to do that. Isn't it their job to make sure that she can work to obtain those skills?
The answer to that is generally yes. They would only be able to not provide that if they could prove not only that the person doesn't have the skills, but doesn't have the ability to acquire them.
And that's their job. It's not hers to prove that she can't.
Correct. Now that's an earlier stage. And here's the example I can give you on this is that I worked with a young woman with intellectual disabilities who said she wanted to be a veterinary surgeon. Now I think we all agree that she wouldn't have she couldn't obtain the skills necessary to get that degree. But what we could do was work with her to identify what her interests were that made that interesting and find jobs in that area. In your situation, if you believe and she believes that she has the skills or could acquire them, it's on VR to provide some proof of why they think she can't. You can't just stereotype. You can't just say, you can't be an RN because of this, unless they've got someone willing to put their initials behind that. Someone's got to have some reason other than, I don't think you are. It's why I hate IQ. I hate IQ as a measurement of potential. And I didn't get to make this rap earlier, so I'll make it now. IQ in my mind is evil. So IQ is used to keep people down way too often. Okay, Jenny Hatch, who I told you about, had a measured IQ of 49. And that was used as one of the reasons why she needed a guardian. Her IQ is only 49. Well, do you know what IQ measures? IQ measures your ability to do something you've never done before, in a place you've probably never been, in front of people you've never met. Does that sound like decision making to you? That doesn't measure your ability to learn things. It might measure your ability in some way to learn brand new things. But decision making and job skills are things that we've been building our entire lives. So you shouldn't be able to say, because you couldn't put these puzzles together appropriately, we're going to decide your entire job future. Okay? We look at actual functional tests. I am very happy to be in Missouri, because Missouri actually pioneered that concept, at least with regard to assessments. You've got people here who worked on a wonderful assessment with regard to guardianship that I have completely stolen. Thanks. Instead of IQ, this assessment measures what people can actually do. We don't ask what's your full score on the Woodcock-Johnson. We ask how well do you get to and from work. Can you do this on your own? Can you do it with support? Can you pay your rent? Can you have interpersonal relations? Actual functional questions. Shouldn't that be what we review? Not only in independent living, but in employment? It shouldn't be we have a discrete number that is going to determine your future. It should be we've reviewed what you actually can and can't do, and this is what we feel you actually need. So, ma'am, that's my very long-winded answer to your question. Unless they've got something that absolutely proves she can't and can't acquire it, and maybe they do, but I would ask them for it. Because if they're going to refuse to provide it, I'd say, where's my trial work experience? Where is my assessment? You know, before you say I can't. Other questions on that topic or comments? Ma'am? I'll bring it to you. Anybody here watch Phil Donahue at any point in their lives? Everybody who doesn't know who Phil Donahue is, we all hate you.
On one of the slides, it was stating about assistive technology also. Is it follow the same guidelines as transportation? If they know what they need and present it to the counselor, oh, they're going to hate me.
The answer is yepper.
Okay.
It is on
Thank
the the counselor has to come back and say, and VR has to prove this particular AT you don't need. Okay. To me, yeah, we've gotten all kinds of AT paid for, everything from laptops and iPads. If it's in between you and working, the word is assistive technology. That's a very broad-based word, and like I said, they can't cry poverty if you've already got an IPE. So yes, think broadly. Think about what it is that you need. All kinds of things would fit that rubric. VR can pay for car repairs. They can pay for car adjustments. You know, they can convert a car. If a person has an accident where they lose the use of their legs, they can either pay for adapted vehicle or they can pay to adapt the vehicle you have, if that's what's in between you and working. Remember that last part of the sentence. If they're not doing it just out of the goodness of their heart or because it would make your life easier, you have to connect it to working. So I want to work at this job. This is what's keeping me from doing it. That is what will overcome the barrier. If you don't connect it to the vocational bit, you're not going to get it.
Communication.
One thing we run into with transportation is that they say if it's on a public bus route or public transportation, then they're offering that option.
They are entitled to choose public transportation if that's the option, if the person is able to access the public transportation.
Well, the problem is it's 2.5 hours each way. So, I mean,
what you'd have to be able to show is then that the public transportation option is not appropriate.
Okay.
Because it would not get the person to or from there on time, because it causes an additional hardship. A person with something like, off the top of my head, Crohn's disease doesn't need to be on a bus 2.5 hours, right? So you'd have to make that type of argument, but it's clear they're able to say, this is the least expensive option, show me why it doesn't work. I've had many arguments about paratransit in that way because the paratransit where I was just completely unreliable. But you have, my advice there is usually try what they're offering and show it doesn't work. That makes you much stronger going forward. Others? Okay, so remember, federal law says they've got to get involved as early as possible. And that's why VR can be great. Remember when we talked about transition services? How it helps you get those skills to live in the community, adult living skills, daily living skills, employment skills. VR is part of that. VR is part of those coordinated services to help you identify goals moving forward. Remember one of the transition questions we had for a 14-year-old? What do you want to be? What are you interested in? A vocational assessment can help you understand that, couldn't it? That saves a lot of time and trouble, doesn't it? If VR is at the table, you can get work experience. VR can help set that up. They're supposed to have contacts in the community. You can identify what's in the way of working early. Early, rather than saying come back when you're 18 or come back when you can behave. They're at the table, I can't wait to use that with a kid, by the way. Come back when you can behave. I'll never see you again. They can help you get out of the issues you have with self-determination. They can help you overcome decision-making abilities by providing supports and services like medical and mental health care, like occupational therapy and physical therapy to help build your self-determination. It's why I was so intent on presenting special ed and VR back to back. Because when we say we need to close the on-ramp to guardianship, these are two that go hand in hand. Because I know I said before, what is more Olmsted than dating and socializing in the community? I'd add a third to that. What is more Olmsted than working? Where do we meet so many of our friends? Where do we discuss what we did that day? Where do we learn things? Where do we take part in fantasy football and NCAA polls? Work. It's where we become part of our communities. So special ed and VR can work hand in hand in that from the age of 16. So now let's make it your turn. I want to hear how you would design a plan for an 18-year-old who has in fact graduated high school. This person has an intellectual disability. Limitations found by VR are interpersonal skills, organization, self-care, and this is a person who wants to be a physical therapist. And I want you to take 5 minutes and start thinking about, from what we just discussed, how VR could help overcome those problems and what supports and services might get you there.
Every time we talk about something, she's
For the record, that is not my phone. I know that's not my phone. That's not even making fun of that ringtone. My ringtone is Greg Brady telling me I'm the greatest, grooviest, most understanding person in the whole world. So that's how you know it's mine. I'm going to cut the 5 minutes short just because we're running low on time. So who wants to tell me what would be some VR supports and services to help this person reach his goal? Yeah.
And to understand their limitations in relation to that child.
Have you overcome that? Yes.
Right, but then also becoming self-aware. And then also recognizing that they qualify to be a child.
So let's think about ways to address all of those. If a person, an 18-year-old, wants to be a physical therapist, you make it very clear. Does this person have the abilities to be a physical therapist, have the requisite information and knowledge and skills? There you have your assessment. You can have an assessment specifically around the skills necessary to be a physical therapist. You can work with the person to discuss what the barriers are to getting to that job, and you can address those barriers. So let's say the person has a barrier in manual dexterity, right? Physical therapist manually helping people. We can look at occupational physical therapy. If a person isn't aware enough of his or her limitations and maybe has unrealistic expectations, so long as that person does in fact have the ability to become a physical therapist, if he or she overcomes them, then we address that limitation through counseling, perhaps through on-the-job training. All of these are VR on-the-job training specifically included in that A to T list, as is counseling, as is therapies. So you make excellent points. At 18, none of us really have very good awareness of who we are, what we can do anyway. The beauty of VR is it can help us address and overcome that through on-the-job training and counseling and education. And then the person gets the opportunity to overcome it. Other examples. There's nothing else to get, John.
I wrote down some tech supports for organization, maybe a smartphone or a
Beautiful, because we are in a position right now where organization is something that we can overcome through technology. Assistive technology specifically included in that A to T list. So if a person has trouble getting places on time, we used to set carry on a calendar. Now we can ask Siri to set a reminder for me to do something at a particular time. Perfect example of that. When we deal with interpersonal skills, you don't get along with your coworkers. That's a perfect one for counseling and job coaching. When we talk about self-care, that's an education. That's your perfect personal and other adjustment skills. What I'm trying to get at is we have a panoply of choices that is limited only by our ability to think broadly and our ability to say the magic sentence through VR. Tell me where it says you don't have to do that. If we do that, if we require them to use informed choice properly, if we require them to help overcome these limitations, then we hit our two goals, employability and independence. We work and we avoid guardianship. At this point, I think we've got another speaker coming up, so I will...
Want to take a short break?
Sure, let's take 5 minutes.